Hi, I'm Jeremy Reimer, and this is Microhistory. In the last episode, I tried to answer the question, what was the first personal computer? There were in fact lots of computers that could be considered the first, but I had to pick one. I chose the last but the most important of the firsts. It was the Altair 8800, the brainchild of Ed Roberts. It was the bridge that transformed personal computers from a weird hobby for nerds into a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it happened almost by accident. While the idea of a personal computer dates back to the 1950s, it was only in the early 1970s that it actually became practical. By this time, big computer manufacturers like IBM and Digital had largely adopted integrated circuits. These were chips that had lots of transistors put together and could be purchased in mass quantities to build any kind of computer you could imagine. But by the time you gathered enough of these chips together to make a useful computer, you were looking at something that was the size of a mini fridge and cost over $100,000. And if you wanted to include a hard drive that could save your data, well, that was also as big as a mini fridge and would set you back tens of thousands more. These mini computers had to earn their keep, providing boring but necessary services like payroll for big companies. They were also purchased by universities for research support. Because of their cost, they were meant to be used by many people at the same time. To get a personal computer that a regular human could afford required a leap in technology. And while that leap came from a company we all know, they didn't do it to build a smaller computer. They did it to make a cheaper calculator. It was 1969, and a Japanese company called Busicom approached Intel, which at the time was mostly known for its memory chips, to design the electronics for their new calculator. Intel employee Marcian Hoff realized that his company couldn't hit Busicom's required price point using regular chips. So he and other engineers invented a brand new thing, a microprocessor. This was a single chip that could do all the calculating functions and be reprogrammed with software. It had over 2,000 transistors in a single package, and it was called the 4004. Busicom ran into financial difficulties and went out of business, but Intel now had a whole new product category that they could sell to other companies. They followed up the 4-bit 4004 with the 8-bit 8008 in 1972, which is an interesting story all by itself, and then released the more advanced 8080 in 1974, using lessons they learned from their first two projects. This was the chip that launched the microcomputer revolution. Instead of one or more printed circuit boards for just the central processing unit, now you could buy a single chip and you'd have the heart of a computer right there. As we saw in the last video, lots of people had the idea to make personal computers from the 8008 and the 8080, but it took Ed Roberts to take this crazy idea and turn it into a real business. Even then, it only happened because he was desperate. Ed Roberts was born in Miami, Florida in 1941. His mother was a nurse and his father ran a small appliance repair business. Ed was interested in electronics from an early age. In high school, he built a small relay-based computer in order to turn the lights on and off. That's not something that most people do at that age, and certainly not back then. But electronics wasn't Ed's only passion. He also loved biology, and he dreamed of becoming a doctor. He enrolled at the University of Miami with a bio major, but a doctor there was impressed with his talents at electronics and convinced him to change his major to engineering instead. After all, he could still enroll in medical school afterwards. In 1962, with his new wife now pregnant, he decided to leave school and join the US Air Force to pay for his college education. He spent his time in the Air Force working at the Cryptographic Equipment Maintenance School, then got his electrical education degree in 1968. He still wanted to become a doctor, but he was told that at age 27, he was too old. Ed was now a commissioned officer in the US Air Force and working at the laser division of the Weapons Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's where he met Forrest Mims, who shared his love of model rocketry and electronics. They decided to start a company together in 1969. They called it MITS, which was meant to sound a bit like MIT but stood for Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. They sold a few sensor kits for model rockets, but then Forrest left to start a career as a technology writer. Ed decided to shift the focus of MITS to selling calculators instead. Electronic calculators were big business in the early 70s, as companies like Intel were finding out. Ed designed MIT's first calculator, the Model 816, with the help of William Yates, who had also worked with him in the Laser Weapons Lab. The calculator sold much better than the model rocket sensors. By 1973, MITS was selling over $1 million worth of calculators a year. But trouble was on the horizon. Intel wasn't the only company trying to figure out ways to make cheaper calculators. The electronics giant Texas Instruments had similar ideas, and they started producing proprietary chipsets that let them take over the calculator market. In 1974, Ed found that he could walk into any electronics store and buy a brand new calculator for less money than MITS would spend to purchase the chips and parts to build one. MITS was now $300,000 in debt, and Ed had to decide whether to give up or to try and launch a new product to save the company. One of the options he had designed for the Model 816 calculator was a programming interface. With Intel's new 8080 microprocessor, Ed realized that he could now realize his long-held dream of building his own personal computer. He went to the bank to plead his case for his new idea.
And we went to the bank and had a late-night meeting, and the issue was whether we closed MITS down or they loaned us an additional $65,000. And I was asked how many machines did I think we would sell in the next year after it was introduced. And I said 800, and was considered a wild-eyed optimist at that.
With the cash in hand, Ed worked with William Yates to design the new MITS computer around the Intel 8080 chip. Ed was the only electrical engineer at MITS, and he also ran the company, so he had to be both an engineering wizard and a business genius at the same time. He convinced Intel to give him a bulk discount for their 8080 microprocessor, which normally sold for $375 for a single chip. Ed purchased 1,000 of them, which was by far the biggest order that Intel had received for the 8080. He got them for $75 each. Ed designed his computer around what was called a bus. This was basically a set of wires and pins that you could use to plug in connections between the microprocessor, memory, and any other device that you wanted, such as keyboards or terminals, and provide power to all of them. Ed found a source for 100-pin connectors from a company called AMP that cost $7 each. This bus was the nervous system of the computer. The Intel 8080, along with a host of support chips, was on a separate card that plugged directly into the bus. Since it was the brains of the computer, it acted as a traffic cop to ensure that all the other devices would take their turn to communicate over the shared wires. To help market the computer, Ed arranged for an article that would appear on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine for their January 1975 issue. The headline was, "World's First Mini-Computer Kit to Rival Commercial Models." Back then, the term microcomputer hadn't been invented yet, so this was being advertised as a much cheaper mini-computer. In fact, it was inspired by mini-computers in more than one way. Ed Roberts admitted that he got the idea for the front panel design from the Data General Nova mini-computer. But the Nova cost $4,000 when it was introduced in 1969. Ed Roberts set the price of his new computer kit at 1/10 of that, $439 for a kit or $621 fully assembled. The two products may have looked similar, but this was a completely new and untested market. The computer needed a name. Legend has it that Les Solomon, the editor of Popular Electronics, asked his daughter to name it, and she said, "Why not call it the Altair, since that's where the Enterprise is going tonight?" A different story has Solomon asking his staff to give it a name, the staff deciding that it was a stellar event, and John McVeigh suggesting Altair, the 12th brightest star in the sky. As a die-hard nerd, you can probably guess which version of the story I prefer. In any case, the magazine article ignited a pent-up demand for personal computers that surprised even Ed Roberts. They immediately sold 1,000 units and continued to sell over 1,500 a month. People even drove out to Albuquerque and camped outside MIT's headquarters just so they could get their computer a little bit faster. It was insane.
There were some of us that lusted after computers, really, at that time. All the computers in the world tended to be in big centers, and you had to get permission to get close to them, and it was, nobody had access to computers then. And the idea that you could have your own computer and do whatever you wanted to with it whenever you wanted to was fantastic.
As revolutionary as the Altair was, the computer was extremely limited when it was first announced. It had a tiny amount of onboard memory, and the only way to interact with it was with the set of switches and lights on the front panel. Of course, Ed Roberts knew that computers, even personal computers, required more memory and keyboards, displays, and storage options. In fact, MITS advertised all these options as being available with additional add-on boards. But MITS couldn't even keep up with the demand for the computer alone. This left a lot of early adopters with a brand new computer that, quite frankly, didn't do very much. Keen to figure out what they could do with their new computers, nerds everywhere started forming computer clubs, like the Homebrew Computer Club in California, moderated by Lee Felsenstein.
I'd start the meeting by making a horrendous loud noise because everyone was talking and I had to get some attention somehow. And I would use it to call on the person in question. I'd make threatening gestures with it. Most of us were in the electronics industry to a certain extent. There was also a stratum of physicians. And there were a lot of radio amateurs, for instance, finding a new technology that wasn't stale. But most of us were at a sort of middle level downwards. We saw ourselves as crazed, ignored geniuses, or possibly geniuses, but at least we could each hope to get our hands on a computer of our own.
These clubs helped the early adopters fill in the gaps that MITS had left open. Club members ended up launching their own companies to build memory boards, serial boards to attach to teletypes, or even video terminals, and even the Cromemco Dazzler, a color graphics card that was the first of its kind for a personal computer. Many of these companies went on to build their own computers. Ed believed, correctly, that a personal computer wouldn't be successful without an easy-to-use programming language. You could program the Altair directly in 8080 machine code, but it was slow, painful, and required a lot of patience.
So if you had a program that was 100 bytes long, you had to go through this procedure 100 times to load that into memory.
It took a long time.
I bet it did. And what happened if you lost power or you lost your way in the middle?
You cried.
What the Altair needed was an easy-to-use programming language, one that was universally known and suitable for beginners. What it needed was a language called BASIC. BASIC, which stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, was created in 1964 by John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz. It was intended to be easier to read and write than Fortran, which was the standard language in use at the time. The idea behind BASIC was to make programming easy enough for anyone to learn. It used simple English words like for, next, and go to. Today, if people remember BASIC at all, it's as a toy language, something only beginners would ever want to use, and if they're old enough, they might remember it from microcomputers they owned in the 1980s. But in the 1970s, BASIC was commonplace on all the major mini-computer systems, like the Digital Equipment PDP series or the Data General Nova. John and Thomas released BASIC for free, so it spread like wildfire. Sure, it was sometimes used for frivolous and fun things like this copy of 101 Basic Computer Games from 1973, but it was also used for serious software development. My father once wrote statistical programs for doctors using BASIC on an IBM System 360 mainframe for Vancouver General Hospital. When Paul Allen bought a copy of the popular electronics magazine with the Altair on the cover, he rushed over to his friend Bill Gates and told him, "The revolution is happening without us!" They got on the phone to MITS immediately and told them they had a nearly finished version of the BASIC programming language that could work on the new Altair. They didn't, of course. They still had to make one. But how could they do that without having an Altair to work on? At the time, nobody had one yet. They ended up writing an emulator for Intel's 8080 microprocessor on a PDP-10 mini computer at Harvard, where Bill was studying. Using the 8080's machine language instructions, they created a BASIC similar to the original that Bill had used on a PDP-11 while he was in high school. It wasn't easy. The whole language had to fit inside 4 kilobytes of memory, since that was the maximum memory card you could get for the Altair. That's slightly over 4,000 characters. Less data than 3 pages of a typed essay, double-spaced. Paul Allen took the prototype BASIC interpreter and flew over to Albuquerque to test it out. At the time, it had never been run on a real Altair before.
So we'd created this BASIC interpreter. Paul took the paper tape and flew out. In fact, the night before, he got some sleep while I double-checked everything to make sure that we had it all right.
If that demo hadn't worked, history might have turned out very differently. As it was, Paul and Bill signed contracts with MITS, moved to Albuquerque, and completed work on their BASIC. They formed a small company called Microsoft. You know, software, but for microcomputers. I wonder how that all turned out. With the basic $439 Altair unit, you couldn't do very much. You could program directly in machine language using the front panel switches and see the results of your program, also in binary, on a row of red LEDs. As limited as this was, people actually managed to make games with it. One of the most popular was called Kill the Bit, where you had to flick a switch precisely when a red light passed over it, and if you missed, a new light would turn on. It was harder than it sounds. Some homebrew computer club members went even further.
Steve Dompier set up an Altair, laboriously keyed a program into it. Somebody knocked the plug out of the wall, and he had to do that all over again, but nobody knew what this was about. After all, was it just going to sit and flash its lights? No.
You put a little transistor radio next to the Altair, and he would, by manipulating the length of loops in the software, could play tunes.
The radio began playing The Fool on the Hill. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, in the tinny little tunes that you could tell were coming from the noise that the computer was generated, being picked up by the radio. Everybody rose and applauded.
Most people weren't going to be satisfied with just killing bits and creating tinny music, however. Fortunately, if you spent a bit more money, you could get a full computer that was ready to do anything you could imagine. You just needed a 4K expansion board, a copy of Microsoft's BASIC on paper tape, a serial port board, a teletype, which was a big typewriter connected to a printer that talked to the serial port and let you load programs from the paper tape, and maybe if you were really adventurous, a video display terminal like this shiny new ADM3, and finally a tape cassette interface so that you could actually save your work. The serial port board let the Altair talk to a teletype or terminal, but it couldn't do anything fancy like moving the cursor around. Still, this was enough to enable a whole host of applications that looked pretty much like the ones running on $100,000 mini computers. You could run most of these games, for example, like Star Trek or Hammurabi, or you could run an inventory application for your small business. Sure, there were limitations. You had way less memory, and the computer was much slower than the big boys, but it also fit on a desk and belonged only to you. You didn't have to share your computer with anyone. Ed Roberts is widely credited as being the father of the personal computing industry. He didn't just create the first commercially successful personal computer, he created a template for everyone else to follow. His use of an off-the-shelf central processing unit, an expansion bus to easily add more options and peripherals, and a version of the basic programming language were key decisions, but he did way more than that. Ed hired David Bunnell, a technical writer, to help jumpstart this new industry. David started a newsletter called Computer Notes, the very first magazine about personal computers. David then proposed the very first personal computer convention, the Altair Convention. Ed also started the first computer retail stores. By 1977, if you excluded Radio Shack, the MITS stores comprised more than 80% of computer retail stores in the United States. He also created the first personal computer dealer networks. So, despite the Altair not technically being the first personal computer, it was definitely the first one that mattered. Its influence on the world of computing can still be felt to this day. But being the first didn't guarantee continued success. MITS had trouble filling all their orders and had problems with quality control, especially with their 4K memory boards. This left an opening for new companies to offer their own expansion boards and eventually their own computers. In 1976, only a year after the Altair's introduction, MITS was just one of dozens of companies offering personal computers, and it was rapidly losing market share. Ed Roberts wasn't having as much fun as he did at the beginning, and was getting tired of managing what was now a multi-million-dollar company with 230 employees. He had been bundling Pertec Corporation's disk drives with newer Altair models, and offered the company a large share of MITS. In May 1977, Pertec acquired MITS completely for $6 million in stock. Ed's share was $2 million. With this sudden windfall, Ed Roberts decided he would invest in himself. He bought a farm in Wheeler County, Georgia, where his grandparents had lived, and started a software company. He still dreamed of becoming a doctor, but he remembered how he was considered too old back in 1968. Was this dream even still possible? Amazingly, the nearby Mercer University opened up a new medical program, and Ed applied and was accepted. He graduated with an MD in 1986 at age 45. He became a country doctor, treating patients in rural Georgia and running his entire practice using Altair computers. In 2009, Ed Roberts was elected to the Medical Honor Society Alpha Omega Alpha for his dual accomplishments in creating the personal computer industry and his dedication to rural medicine. A year later, he died from complications due to pneumonia. He was 68 years old. The Altair created the personal computer industry. It established the basics of a desktop computer, priced at a level an individual could afford, delivered in a metal box with expansion slots, connected to a teletype or display terminal, and running a basic interpreter. The Altair spawned computer dealerships, computer magazines, and computer conventions. Later Altair models added disk drives, simplified the front panel, and even offered alternative microprocessors. But the Altair never survived the sale of MITS to Pertec. It was eclipsed by a wave of imitators. Some were direct clones and copycats, while others were innovative new designs. In our next story, we're going to look at one of the clones, the first personal computer clone, in fact. It was the IMSI 8080, and its story is a wild one. Stay tuned for the next episode of Microhistory. Oh, and because I always forget, don't forget to like and subscribe this video so that more people will find out about it, thanks to YouTube's amazing algorithm, which is perfect in every way.